Hi, I'm Jon Mirsalis. I'm a film historian, silent film accompanist, and I created and manage the website lonchaney.org. And I'm here to tell you about The Phantom of the Opera, directed by Rupert Julian and starring the legendary Lon Chaney, the man of 1,000 faces. What you're watching is not the original 1925 version of Phantom, but a reissue version from 1929. With the coming of sound, many studios went to their vaults and pulled out some of their greatest hits of the past and added music and sound effects for a re-release. A number of silent classics like The Birth of a Nation, Way Down East, and The Big Parade got sound makeovers for audiences of 1929 and 30 as an easy way to milk some more profits out of an existing classic. But for Phantom, they went a step further. Besides adding a music and sound effects track, they did a major re-edit of the film. Several talking sequences were added, and all of the opera sequences were reshot with new actors to capitalize on the music and singing. This resulted in a number of significant changes to the film, and I'll point out some of these modifications as we watch the film. The soundtrack for the reissue print does survive, but we're watching this with the very fine orchestral score composed by Gabriel Thibodeau, a terrific Canadian silent accompanist and composer, and he's conducting the Musique de Montreal Orchestra. I know you're all watching this with the commentary track first in order to hear me ramble on, but when you finish, go back and watch the film with the score if you haven't already done so. This opening scene we're watching was a spoken prologue in the sound reissue. Watching this as a silent film really makes no sense at all, but this man with a lantern sequence has remained in most versions of the film. The Phantom you'll see in the background isn't Lon Chaney, but an unidentified actor used to recreate the new opening sequence. There's no new Lon Chaney footage in this version, as he was under contract to MGM when this version was done, so he had no involvement. The cost of this reissue version was $113,449, which is about as much as most of the new Universal productions of that year. The reissue print opened on December 15th of 1929 and was a huge success, earning $419,096 in revenues for Universal, and that translated to a profit of $123,428. That was an extraordinary amount of money in those early days of the Great Depression. You'll often hear this referred to as a 1930 reissue because it played throughout the spring of 1930, and that's when most people saw it. But it did open in a few cities at the end of 1929, so we refer to it by its initial release date. For those of you who are shocked by this crass commercialization of Universal tinkering with a great cinema classic as they did with this, I'll remind you of the reissued version of E.T. the Extraterrestrial, where the guns were removed by CGI, or the upcoming 3D version of Titanic. So I guess things haven't changed much in Hollywood when there's a buck to be made. I love the sets in this film. They rebuilt a mock-up of the Paris Opera House, and later in the film you'll see the terrific Catacombs sets. The sets are the work of several men. Ben Carré served as art director in that he designed most of the layout of the Opera House and the Catacombs, but he received no screen credit. When the film came out, he was shocked to see that they had used his designs, but that he had received no credit for it. The sets themselves were designed by E.E. Sheely and Sidney Ullman, and set construction was supervised by Archie Hall. The Opera House set was built on Universal Stage number 28, and some of the opera boxes still remain there today. It was reused in countless films, including The Last Performance in 1929, which also starred Mary Philbin, The Last Warning, a Paul Leany mystery film, and almost every Universal film of the 30s and 40s that needed an opera house set. Carl Laemmle made a habit of hiring all of his relatives and putting them on the Universal payroll. The joke around Universal was, Carl Laemmle has a very big family. One of the dancing girls in this is his niece, Carla Laemmle, who's still alive today, and she frequently tells stories about working on Phantom. All of this ballet footage that we're watching right now was reshot for the 1929 version. It is different from what was used in the 1925. The print we were watching came from a 35mm print made from the material at the George Eastman House Film Archive. The Eastman print was purchased in the 1950s by then-curator James Card. The nitrate negative was already decomposing, as will be seen later in the picture. Phantom expert Scott McQueen believes that this version we are watching is not a mute version of the sound reissue, but is actually a foreign-release silent print from 1929. It's a plausible theory, but no one has ever been able to confirm whether this is the case or not. We do know that the surviving sound discs for the reissue print do not sync up with this print, and some of the scenes from this appear to be shot from a slightly different angle, which was common for foreign negatives. Foreign negatives would typically be shot with a second camera operated by a slightly less experienced cameraman and at a slightly less desirable angle. And in cases where both American and foreign versions are available, most critics agree that the foreign version is inferior, albeit in very minor ways. The bottom line is that no one entirely knows what the derivation of this particular print is, but I'm inclined to believe Scott McQueen's theory on where it comes from. There are references here to the Phantom occupying Box 5 in the Opera House. I went to the Paris Opera House in the 1990s with the hope of visiting Box 5 just so I could say I'd been there. To my surprise and disappointment, I discovered there is no Box 5. The numbers decrease on one side of the theater with odd numbers, even numbers on the other, and they went 13, 11, 9, 7, and then I ran into a security wall. There may have been a Box 5 years ago, or perhaps this was an in-joke that Gaston Leroux teased his readers with. Some of these opening sequences, including the ballet and opera sequences, were shot in color. I'll talk more about the color when we get to the surviving color sequences of this print a little bit later. All of the opening ballet sequences, as I mentioned earlier, were newly shot for the 29 reissue. You can tell also because the original shoots the scene more from the middle and somewhat lower in the theater. This is taken from a much higher camera, as if they were doing it from a crane or a ladder or something that raised it up. While working on The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Chaney used dressing room number 5, which started a long tradition at Universal that lasted for over 20 years. Number 5 became known as the Bouga-Boudoir and was used by Chaney again on Phantom of the Opera and was used in many subsequent horror films of the 20s, 30s, and 40s. I guess it became like a haunted dressing room at Universal. I don't know if this is actually Chaney shown in the silhouette in Box 5. It could be Chaney, a stand-in, or even a mannequin with a cape on. There's no real way to tell because the character doesn't move at all. Many of the musical sequences in the 29 version go on longer than in the original 25 version, presumably because they wanted to present complete musical numbers that audiences could listen to as well as watch. Whenever we cut to the audience in the upcoming scene, you'll notice that we're going from 1929 footage here, newly shot, and then the audience scenes are intercut from the 1925 print. So here's the end of the 1929. And now we cut to audience from the 1925 print, applauding something that they will hear 4 years in the future. The little guy here is Snitz Edwards playing Florine Papillon. Edwards is one of my favorite character actors of the silent era. He appeared in over 60 films, and many of the major classics of the silent era. He was Douglas Fairbanks' assistant in The Thief of Baghdad, and he appeared in 3 Buster Keaton films. He was Keaton's valet in Battling Butler, he appeared in College with Keaton, and perhaps most famously, the very strange attorney in Keaton's 7 Chances. His real name was Edward Newman, and he was born in 1868, which makes him about 57 when this was made. That's actually fairly old for someone working in Hollywood at that time. Later in life, he suffered from severe arthritis, and he retired from films after appearing in a small role in Public Enemy with James Cagney, and he died in 1937. One of my favorite roles with him is in an obscure film called The Cruise of the Jasper Bee with Rod LaRock, where he plays the villain in what is otherwise a very funny comedy. Here is another favorite character of mine in this film version. It's the mysterious Ledoux, played by Arthur Edmund Carew. He has this wonderfully mysterious creepiness about him. Some of his footage is cut from this print. In the original, we learn more about how he's been tracking Eric for years through his work with the secret police. But even with his part reduced, in this he's still very effective as the strange Persian. Carew's real name was the delightfully colorful Hovsepian. And like Snitz Edwards, Carew died in 1937. But he appeared in a number of significant sound films, including the early Technicolor productions Mystery of the Wax Museum and Dr. X, both done for Warner Brothers and directed by Michael Curtiz. For horror buffs, if you haven't seen those, I strongly recommend that you catch these as well. Snitz Edwards here often put into films for comic relief because, quite frankly, he was a very funny-looking guy. Here's yet another great character role in this film, Bernard Siegel appearing as Joseph Bouquet. Siegel has a small role in this film, but he co-starred opposite Chaney and Loretta Young 3 years later in Laugh Clown Laugh, and gave quite a wonderful performance in what was then a major role playing Lon Chaney's brother. He had nearly as much screen time as Chaney. One of the things I like about Phantom, besides Chaney's performance, is all these great character actors providing additional color and flavor to the film. The story of Phantom is based on the 1910 novel written by Gaston Leroux, and many screenwriters had a role in developing the screenplay. Elliot Clausen is given primary screen credit, but James Spearing, Bernard McConville, and Robert Schrock all contributed to the final screenplay. The book focuses much more on the romance between Christine and the Phantom, and in early treatments of the script, they followed that theme more closely, but they eventually decided to abandon that approach and turn it into a gothic drama, because the sense was that audiences either wouldn't accept that Christine could love this hideous monster, or if they did believe it, they would then be depressed by the eventual failure of their love. The reissue version we're watching is, frankly, not as well developed as the 1925 version from a story standpoint. The original is longer and develops the characters more fully, but this version is the one most commonly shown because the print quality is far superior. Beautiful 35mm prints of the reissue version still exist, but all that survives of the original 1925 version are 16mm prints. Some of the major studios released their films through home and educational sales in 16mm. Paramount released some of their films in slightly truncated versions through the Kodascope libraries, a branch of Eastman Kodak. Universal released films through their own show-at-home library service, and for the most part their prints were released uncut. Both The Hunchback of Notre Dame and Phantom of the Opera survive only in these 16mm show-at-home prints. I'll talk more about lost films later in this commentary track. Because they had no interest in their silent library, Universal let the copyright of Phantom of the Opera lapse in 1953, putting this timeless classic into the public domain. And that's another reason that this has been a perennial favorite on PBS stations, online downloads, and cheap video releases everywhere. As I mentioned, the original 1925 version does flesh out the characters better, but that version runs about 20 minutes longer and is a bit slower. This version is snappier, and I always debate which of the two versions I want to run for people who've never seen the film. Because of the print quality, this is the version I usually pick. Here is the first of the significant changes in the 1929 reissue print. The actress here is Virginia Pearson. In the 1925 version, Pearson played Carlotta, the opera prima donna, not her mother. But because they were reshooting the opera footage with a new actress, they had to alter the story so that this scene would make sense without reshooting it. That actually is quite easy to do by simply substituting a few of the intertitles, and voila, Carlotta becomes her mother. It's one of the minor character changes, although later we'll see that some of the actual performers in the Faust opera also changed in the version we're watching now. So we're about to meet our Christine, Mary Philbin. Philbin was only 17 when she was cast as Christine Daae. She had a brief career appearing in films such as The Merry-Go-Round in 1923, The Last Performance in 1929, and what is certainly her finest role as the blind girl in The Man Who Laughs, with Conrad Veidt and directed by Paul Leany in 1928. Philbin retired from films in 1931 and continued to live on Fairfax Avenue in Hollywood until her death in 1993. She was extremely shy after retirement and very rarely came out for any kind of film event. She did sign autographs through the mail, but in all my years of visiting stars in Hollywood, I never once saw her in person. Raoul here is played by Norman Carey, who was a popular leading man in Universal films of the 20s. His real name was Arnold Kaiser, and he began his film career in the teens, appearing with both Douglas Fairbanks in Manhattan Madness in 1916 and as Mary Pickford's love interest in The Little American in 1917. Pickford must have liked him because he was cast in her next two films, The Little Princess and Amarylli of Clothesline Alley. He appeared with Chaney in The Talk of the Town in 1918, and then in The Hunchback of Notre Dame in 1923, where he appeared with Chaney and Patsy Ruth Miller, and that film established him as a major leading man for Universal. He appeared with Mary Philbin in The Merry-Go-Round in 1923, which was also directed by Rupert Julian, the director on Phantom. I'll be saying quite a bit more about Julian later. He was again paired with Lon Chaney in the 1927 MGM film, The Unknown, where he co-starred with Joan Crawford. Carey didn't fare well in sound films, and this reissue probably didn't help. He participated in the reissue and did some talking sequences. Both he and Philbin came across as very stiff, and he made only a few more sound films before retiring. He died in 1956. He's 31 years old here in Phantom and at the peak of his popularity. That's John St. Paulus playing Raoul's brother Philippe. Some sources state that Edward Martindale played Philippe in the reissue, but that certainly appears to be St. Paulus to me, and he's listed in the film credits, so where those incorrect references came from, I have no idea. In the original version of the film, there are references to the Angel of Music that speaks to Christine from behind the mirror. The Angel of Music theme was a major element of the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical, and there was even a song by that name in the show. But they removed all references to the Angel of Music in the 1929 reissue for reasons I don't entirely understand, as it makes you wonder why Christine was so entranced with the voice that speaks to her. Carey and Philbin certainly make a very attractive couple, and I'm sure they were picked because she's quite beautiful and he's a very handsome leading man. But they aren't the most exciting actor and actress to watch together. They certainly don't have tremendous range in performance, but they make for very pleasing characters. And now the mystery begins, and we're about to be introduced to the Phantom. Unlike the reshot opening prologue, this is indeed Lon Chaney's shadow we're looking at, and you can tell by watching how his hands move. Chaney spends most of the first half of the picture as a shadow or wearing a mask, and for a silent picture, this meant that all his emotion had to be conveyed with body language. Chaney had great hands, not just in this movie, but in all his pictures. They were incredibly expressive, and I want you to pay attention to how there's almost a sensuality to the way he moves his hands and fingers throughout the film. It's quite interesting to look at, and even in some of his early teens films, I can see the character from a distance, and I'll say, oh, there's Chaney, because I can tell by the way he turns his wrist and moves his hands. Like many people, my interest in Chaney started by reading Forrest J. Ackerman's magazine, Famous Monsters of Filmland, when I was a kid. There was a monthly page called Lon Chaney Shall Not Die that always featured a different photo of Chaney in some fascinating makeup. As a kid, I loved horror movies, but of course I never got to see anything with Chaney because silent films didn't regularly run on TV then. We certainly didn't have Turner Classic Movies or DVDs at the time. Then when I was a senior in high school, Paul Killiam's series The Silent Years ran on PBS, and I caught The Hunchback of Notre Dame and was just totally blown away by the movie and by Chaney's performance. I saw Phantom of the Opera the next year as a freshman in college, and it was this 1929 reissue print, though not as good a quality as we are seeing today. And there was no accompaniment, so the audience just sat there in total silence, but I was still mesmerized by it. At that time in the early 70s, once you'd seen Phantom and Hunchback, you were pretty much done with readily available Chaney films, and I found that incredibly frustrating. It wasn't until I began collecting 8mm and 16mm films in the mid-70s that I began to discover some of the other more obscure Chaney films, and I was hooked. I'll talk more later in the film about lost films and why it's so difficult to see some of Chaney's films. Here's Virginia Pearson again as Carlotta's mother. All of this footage obviously derives from the 1925 version. None of the segments with the theater managers were reshot, so they simply reused all the old scenes, and hence the need to convert Virginia Pearson from Carlotta to her mother. Again, if you watch enough Chaney films, you'll recognize his hands and his gestures. And the mystery continues, with more letters, more notes, more curses on the Opera House. You can even tell in this footage from the 1925 that even by 1929 there was already some wear on the negatives, because the 29 footage is spotlessly clean and some of the 25 is already showing some scratches and signs of wear from the various prints that were struck off the 1925 negative. Now, this is the new Carlotta here, played by actress Mary Fabian. This appears to be her only film credit, and she was likely a stage actress who was picked for the role. Her singing voice was used for the soundtrack, so she is actually singing, and I think she was picked more for her voice than anything else. But she was brought in specifically for this and has no other film credits. I've tried to track her down and learn more about her, and there's very little out there on Mary Fabian. So we're approaching now one of the great set pieces of this film, the sequence with the falling chandelier. The sequence was shot by slowly lowering the chandelier onto the audience, but under-cranking the camera so that it appeared to fall rapidly. I'm guessing it was probably shot at something on the order of 6 to 8 frames per second, and then in the silent, most likely projected at about 20 frames per second. Rupert Julian was the director, and he wanted the scene to go to black with the chandelier crash. That doesn't make a lot of sense for a couple of reasons. First, it then leaves you with a silent movie with nothing on the screen to see. And second, it wouldn't make sense anyway because the chandelier is not the only lighting in the theater. The cinematographers and the art directors argued with Julian about it, but he insisted, and he was a very demanding director. Cinematographers often carry around a piece of blue filter to look at a scene, and by looking through they can determine how the contrast will look in the final film. Getting tired of arguing, cinematographer Charles Van Anger decided to get a blue poker chip and he was holding it in his hand, putting it up to his eye, looking, saying, "Yes, this looks good. This looks very good." Rupert Julian saw this, came over, yanked it away from him, and said, "Let me see what this looks like." And he looked through the poker chip, which of course you can't see through. He obviously saw nothing and said, "Now, this is the way I want it." And that's the way they shot the scene. You wonder at what point that Julian figured out that he'd been hoodwinked. This scene goes on much longer than it should for a silent film because they wanted Fabian to be able to sing all of the Jewel song from Faust before the chandelier falls, and they timed it out so that the chandelier would crash just at the end of the piece. The opera footage here is all new, but the intercuts of the audience and the chandelier falling, again, are all from the 1925 version. Inserting musical numbers or talking sequences into silent films was pretty common in 1929. Following the success of The Jazz Singer in 1927, there was a move to convert any ongoing silent films into talkies. In this case, it was a little different because they planned the entire reissue around the new sound footage. But in other films, a silent film would be made into an ersatz talkie by cutting in a couple of talking sequences into the silent footage. Lonesome in 1928 and The Mysterious Island in 1929 are good examples of this. And the very fluid camera movements of the silent film suddenly grind to a halt when the talking starts. That's less true of musical sequences where the actors at least get to perform much as they would on stage, but it still does slow down the pace of the film, especially when we're seeing this silent, albeit for this version we're hearing vocals that have been added along with the Thibodeau score. And there goes the chandelier, undercranked and appearing to drop very quickly. Although Chaney is best remembered and his cult status the result of his horror roles, he actually made precious few true horror films. In fact, A Blind Bargain, done in 1922, is probably his only legitimate film in the horror genre, although The Phantom of the Opera, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, London After Midnight, and The Monster, most people would qualify as horror films. They certainly have macabre elements to them. The fact that most of his early works, including many comedies and light dramas, no longer exist today has helped perpetuate the myth of Chaney as solely a horror star. To say that Chaney was just a horror star is a bit like saying that Laurence Olivier only did Shakespearean roles. In fact, the majority of Lon's performances were straight roles, though often with a somewhat offbeat or crime-oriented storyline. What we can say, though, is that Lon almost never got the girl in his movies. Even when he plays a sympathetic or heroic role, he rarely gets the girl, though there are exceptions. Nomads of the North and The Shock are two rare examples of later films where he gets the girl. And in While the City Sleeps, he doesn't get his first choice, Anita Page, but he does get a consolation prize with Polly Moran. I don't think Polly Moran is much of a consolation, but it's, I guess, better than nothing. Some of the later MGM films were shot with alternate endings, sometimes shooting a happy ending for American audiences and a more downbeat ending for the Europeans. One example of this is Laugh Clown Laugh, where in the surviving ending, he falls to his death. But in an alternate happy ending that is now lost, he survives and there is a suggestion that he'll end up with Loretta Young, but it's left a little ambiguous. While Lon had tremendous screen presence, he clearly wasn't the character type that was going to be cast as a heroic leading man. This shot of Norman Carey we just saw hiding behind the curtain was used in the artwork of a number of the phantom print ads in newspapers. They would often shoot scenes, and then an artist would take the photograph and convert it into a sketch that would be used in newspaper print ads. And the scene of Carey at the curtain is one of the ads, but many other scenes were used as well. I'll talk a little more later about one critical sequence now missing from the film that was used very widely in the print ad. And now we get our first good look at the Catacombs sets, which are quite wonderful. Again, the design of Ben Carré, who sketched out all the basic elements of the Catacombs. And now here we are, 30 minutes into the movie, a third of the way in. We've yet to see the Phantom of the Opera, the title character. But here now we will get our first glimpse of Lon Chaney. Audiences of the time were used to seeing Chaney in grotesque characters. This ranged from his unforgettable performance as Quasimodo in the 1923 Hunchback of Notre Dame, the legless gangster in The Penalty from 1920, Chinese characters in Shadows and Outside the Law, cripples in The Shock and Flesh and Blood, a clown in He Who Gets Slapped, a dual role of mad scientist and monkey man in A Blind Bargain, and so on and on. But here, in his first scenes in Phantom, we don't see his face at all. And what I really like about this part of the film is that once again, you can watch his hands. Simple gestures with his hands and fingers take on ominous meaning as the Phantom begins to lead Christine through the catacombs to his hidden chamber. There's an apocryphal story that has circulated over the years that states that Irving Thalberg at MGM loaned Chaney to Universal to make Phantom because he realized that the film would be a huge success and would elevate Chaney's box office draw. It's a great story and it makes wonderful copy for movie star magazines, but it just isn't so. Chaney was still a free agent at the time he made Phantom and did not have to negotiate a release from MGM. Chaney appeared in Universal productions beginning as early as 1912, and he worked exclusively for Universal until 1918. But Universal was, frankly, on the low end of the production quality scale, and in 1918 he went freelance. He continued to work sporadically for Universal in films such as Todd Browning's The Wicked Darling in 1919 and Outside the Law in 1920. He returned to Universal for The Trap in 22, The Shock and Hunchback of Notre Dame in 1923. Chaney had no particular love for Universal or Carl Laemmle, but he recognized a good opportunity when he saw it and recalled his tremendous success in Universal's The Hunchback of Notre Dame 2 years earlier, so there was no question that he would accept the role of the Phantom. While Phantom is hailed today as one of the masterpieces of the silent era, this was a movie that almost never got made, as it was plagued from the start by production problems. Rupert Julian, an actor and director who had worked at Universal since the teens, was selected to direct. Julian had previously worked as an actor with Lon Chaney in The Small Town Girl and The Kaiser, the Beast of Berlin, a performance that made him famous as the most villainous of villains. Critics wrote about how amazingly evil Julian was and how effective he was as the Beast of Berlin, because he was in reality a very autocratic director who reveled in bullying everyone on the set, including Lon Chaney. Julian and Chaney weren't even speaking to each other through much of the film, and reports have it that Julian would tell someone else, "Tell Lon to do such and such," and Chaney would reply back, "Tell Julian to go to hell." The script went through numerous rewrites before and during production. Unconfirmed rumors have it that Chaney directed some scenes while Julian was storming around the set. To make matters worse, Julian's wife, actress Elsie Jane Wilson, who was apparently quite a prima donna in her own right, marched around the set, loudly expressing her opinion of how the films should be shot. By the time the first principal shooting ended, Julian had shot about 35 reels of film for what would eventually become a 9-reel picture, though in a very early version it was cut to 22 reels for a length of about 4 hours. That version was never shown in theaters as Universal realized it was insanely long. After shooting was completed, the picture was previewed in Los Angeles in January 1925. Carl Laemmle, the head of Universal Pictures, was unhappy with the preview and ordered that additional footage be shot. Edward Sedgwick, who is better known as a fast-paced comedy director, was assigned to direct a new climax. Additional romantic subplot footage was also shot, with Ward Crane playing a rival of Norman Carey for Mary Philbin's affections. Walter Anthony was hired to write new intertitles. In April 1925, the film in its new form was again previewed, this time in San Francisco, and Carl Laemmle was still unhappy with the reception the film received. This screening almost didn't happen. Universal planned a huge opening and brought up Mary Philbin and Norman Carey, as well as Universal stars Hoot Gibson and Reginald Denny for an appearance on stage with the film. As the train was just about to pull out of the LA station, the general manager of the studio realized that all the film hadn't been delivered to the train. The train had to leave immediately or they would miss the show. Reginald Denny was a former flyer in the British Flying Corps in World War I, and he volunteered to go back to the studio, pick up the print, and fly it to San Francisco. It took 5 hours by air back then, with refueling stops in Bakersfield and Merced, but he landed at Crissy Field in San Francisco and delivered the print on time. Most of the new scenes, except for the exciting climax, were junked. New scenes with comedian Chester Conklin were added, as well as more new intertitles. After viewing this version, Laemmle ordered the comedy scenes scrapped, and still more intertitles were rewritten to account for the many changes. The film finally premiered on September 6, 1925 in San Francisco. That original 1925 version is available on the Milestone Film Ultimate Phantom of the Opera DVD, and I'm making this shameless plug for that version because I did the score for it. Chaney would totally immerse himself into a role when he was playing it. In a lengthy interview with Ruth Waterbury in the 1920s, he was quoted as saying, "There is no Lon Chaney. There is only the character I'm creating." And in a 1930 interview in the same vein with Gladys Hall for Motion Picture Magazine, he was quoted as follows, "When I am playing a part, I am sometimes, while I am working, lost in the character I have to be. That means that I may be, for the time of working, sad or tragic or thoughtful or scheming. But the instant I leave the set, I close that compartment of my mind. I turn, so to speak, the key in the office door and forget all about it. I've trained myself to do this. It may be some form of self-protection." While Chaney would become totally wrapped up in the roles he played, he had some interesting quirks to keep his tension level low. In his early days, when he was traveling with theater troupes, he was a pretty good artist, and he drew caricatures of the other actors in the road company to pass the time. And actress Esther Ralston, who appeared with him in Oliver Twist, said that he would knit off stage between scenes as a way of relaxing. And there's an eBay item I'd bid on, a sweater knitted by Lon Chaney. In her interview, Ruth Waterbury also asked Chaney, "Have you gotten the philosophy of life out of it all?" Chaney responded, "It's in my pictures. I've tried to show that the lowliest people frequently have the highest ideals. In the lower depths, when life hasn't been too pleasant for me, I've always that gentleness of feeling, that compassion of an underdog for a fellow sufferer. The Hunchback was an example of it. So was the Unknown, and in a different class of society, Mr. Wu. I try to bring that emotion to the screen. Beyond that, I don't fuss." And it is very true. Chaney worked very hard to elicit sympathy for his roles. He did it probably most brilliantly in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, but even in The Penalty, where he plays an utterly brutal gangster who had his legs unnecessarily amputated as a child, you see the agony in his face of this poor, tormented soul. It's something that really made him a great actor. And again, watch his hands. The hands move very slowly, very sensuously. If this bed looks familiar, it was sold by Universal at a props auction, and it turned up years later as Gloria Swanson's bed in Sunset Boulevard. I don't know if they just wanted a flamboyant bed for Norma Desmond, or if this was yet another wink and a nod by Billy Wilder to see how many silent movie fans would make the connection. He certainly did this in many ways, including actors such as Buster Keaton and Erich von Stroheim in his film, to remind viewers of famous individuals from the silent era. The sequence coming up here is where we begin to see signs of the nitrate decomposition present in the Eastman House print that this material derived from. When nitrate film begins to decompose, it gets the mottled appearance that you'll see in several sequences here. Eventually it starts bubbling and turns to goo, and in very advanced stages of decomposition it can react explosively with oxygen and literally blow up. A number of vault fires at studios occurred due to a nitrate print exploding and taking out the entire vault with it. A famous nitrate vault explosion and subsequent fire at MGM in the 1960s destroyed the last known prints of Chaney's London After Midnight, The Big City, and The Tower of Lies. Those are the three late Chaney films that are on many fans' want-to-find lists. But given how old the nitrate prints would be today, it seems highly unlikely at this point that any of them will turn up anywhere. Nevertheless, we can hope to be surprised someday. Once again, I'll be talking more a little later in the commentary about lost films in general. The modeling of the image you see is present in every print of the Phantom reissue that I've ever seen, suggesting that the nitrate was already decomposing in the 1950s when the Eastman print was made. And virtually every print of the reissue version derives from that Eastman material. You can even see signs here in addition to the modeling of a little bit of bubbling in the image, which was also common in nitrate decomp. This decomposition isn't as bad as I've seen in other films. In the surviving 35mm material on Chaney's Outside the Law, there are segments that are so decomposed that the screen literally just turns to bubbles for several seconds at a time. That's a shame because it's quite a good early Todd Browning film. In that one, Chaney plays a dual role as a gangster and a Chinaman. In a neat little bit of editing at the end of the picture, Chinaman Chaney shoots gangster Chaney, so he gets to kill himself. That was one of several films Chaney made with Priscilla Dean. I corresponded with Dean in the early 1980s, and she related a story about working with Chaney that occurred while they were making Paid in Advance in 1919. It was both horrifying and funny at the same time, but it shows what a stickler for detail Chaney was. She wrote, "Lon Chaney played a backwoods character and wore a long, straggling wig. In the story, Lon was in love with Dorothy Phillips, while I was in love with Lon and terribly jealous of Dorothy. In a quarrel scene between Lon and me, as the quarrel warmed up to fever pitch, I commenced to pummel him. He tried to push me away, and I grabbed for his hair. As you know, he was a perfectionist in makeup, and when he put that wig on, it was as if it had been growing there all his life. Something had to give, and it wasn't the wig. It was my fingernails, pulled completely and most painfully right out of my fingers. Lon was terribly distressed, and as I was hustled to the hospital, I promised myself that hereafter I'd be more of an actress and less realistic." We're now approaching what is, in effect, the climax of the first half of the film, the legendary unmasking scene. Universal made sure that no photos or artwork of Chaney without the mask were released before the picture because they wanted to maximize the shock value of the unmasking scene. What I don't know is whether Mary Philbin had seen Chaney's makeup before the scene. Chaney did his own makeup, and it's quite possible that none of the cast or crew saw him unmasked before this scene. It certainly would have been an effective way to elicit additional shock from Philbin. And if you watch her in the scene coming up, she really does look shocked when she sees him for the first time. And here now we are approaching the unmasking scene, probably one of the 2 or 3 most famous pieces of film in cinema history. Whenever someone does a documentary on silent films, you invariably see this sequence. The unmasking scene may seem tame by today's blood and guts slasher movie standards, but it delivered quite a jolt in 1925. Several press reports told of patrons fainting in the theaters during the famous scene. Other theaters reported women screaming. Chaney's makeup so distorts his features that he is almost unrecognizable. Chaney took the secret of his makeups to his grave with him, but numerous writers have guessed at how he affected the hideous phantom death mask. The most often reported method, placing discs in his mouth to raise the cheekbones, seems excessively painful and unnecessary. Makeup man and Chaney historian Michael Blake suggests that Chaney built up his cheeks using cotton and collodion, in much the same way that he achieved the look of the Hunchback in Hunchback of Notre Dame. Michael also attributes the lifting of the nose to gluing a strip of fish skin onto the top of the nose and pulling it tight until the nostrils flared out. The sunken eye look was likely done with shading. I'm most inclined to believe Michael Blake's interpretations, but no one really knows for sure. I do know that with a careful combination of Chaney's makeup and the lighting used, it makes for an incredibly creepy experience that still holds up very well today. The lighting here is quite extraordinary. Lighting technicians typically weren't credited in the mid-20s, and much of the lighting was under the control of the cinematographer. I love the cinematography throughout the film. 3 cinematographers, Charles Van Enger, Milton Bridenbecker, and Virgil Miller, all worked on the picture. They make great use of shadows and spotlighting throughout. Rupert Julian was no great artistic director based on his other films, so I have to attribute much of the look to the art director and the cinematographers. Virgil Miller in an interview once said that Chaney said to him, "Virg, make me look frightening and repulsive, but at the same time make the audience love me." Van Enger was probably the most accomplished of the 3, and I'm guessing that much of the credit for the overall look of Phantom belongs to him. He was cinematographer on The Last of the Mohicans, Salome, The Marriage Circle, Forbidden Paradise, and Lady Windermere's Fan, just to name a few of his silent films, and they're all quite beautiful to look at. Van Enger worked well into the sound era and even worked in television into the 1960s on shows like Lassie, Dobie Gillis, and that great classic of modern television, My Mother the Car. I can't believe I'm discussing My Mother the Car on a commentary track for Phantom of the Opera, but I digress. The unmasking scene occurs exactly halfway into the movie and essentially marks the halfway point of the film. In the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical, they rearranged the scene somewhat so they could end Act 1 with the Falling Chandelier sequence added to the end of the rooftop sequence we'll see in a few minutes. It works well dramatically in the musical, but makes less sense for a logical progression of the story. Several sequences of Phantom were originally shot in the early 2-color process, including the opening scene, the closing scene, some of the opera sequences, and the ball mask sequence we're seeing here, but only the ball mask color sequence survives today. There's some debate about the actual color method used for Phantom. Some report this as being done in Prismacolor, an early process that was invented in 1913 by William Van Doren Kelly and Charles Raleigh. But other equally reliable sources report this as being done in 2-color Technicolor. The footage we are watching right now was taken directly from a 2-color Technicolor nitrate print, so what you are seeing is definitely Technicolor, but it's possible that this was converted from earlier Prismacolor elements. Like the story of the Phantom itself, this is a mystery that we may never entirely solve. Edward Estabrook was brought in as the cinematographer just for the color sequences because he had experience with the new Technicolor process. He went on in the late 20s to photograph Redskin, another two-color Technicolor silent. He worked into the 1930s, but he didn't really have much of a career after Phantom. Technicolor in the mid-1930s became a three-color process with cyan, yellow, and magenta elements. You often hear this referred to as three-strip Technicolor, because three separate negatives were simultaneously shot. The 1920s version we are seeing here is sometimes incorrectly called two-strip Technicolor, but purists will tell you that the correct term is two-color Technicolor, because instead of separate strips, the two colors were shot on alternating frames of the same single strip of film. It's a process that works well for flesh tones and reds, but can't give you a true blue. That's one reason you see such heavy use of red in the costumes in this scene, because that uses the natural Technicolor to the greatest effect. Here's Chaney again as the Red Death. And once again, I want you to check out the great hands and the way he moves them. By the end of this commentary track, you're going to think I have a hand fetish, and I probably do when it comes to Chaney. Color processes were very expensive in the 1920s, so for a major production like Phantom, Universal chose to shoot a few key scenes in color, but shooting the entire film in color would have been prohibitively expensive. A few silent features were shot entirely in color, but it's an extremely small list. By my count, there were only about 11 silent-era features shot in color, and a few of those are early color processes that predate Technicolor. For Technicolor, there's really only The Toll of the Sea in 1922, The Wanderer of the Wasteland in 24, The Black Pirate in 26, The Viking in 29, and The Part-Talkie Mysterious Island also in 1929. Of these, Toll of the Sea, The Black Pirate, and The Viking all survive in color, and they're quite lovely to look at. Even in the 1930s and 40s, Technicolor was used sparingly because of the cost. It really wasn't until the introduction of the inferior but much cheaper Eastman color in the early 1950s that color movies really began to take off. If you ever have a chance to see an original Technicolor dye transfer nitrate print, don't miss the opportunity. The original dye transfer prints are quite stunning to look at. When there's no color in this version, you'll notice that this film has used appropriate tints for scenes. This was a common technique in the silent era, tinting night scenes blue, fire red, daylight yellow, and so forth. Many film negatives were even arranged in tinting order so that all the blue scenes are on one reel, all the red on another, and so forth. This made it easy to produce multiple tinted prints in the lab, printing them up and then putting them in the appropriate dye bath, and then they could easily be assembled after tinting. The problem comes in when we find one of those tinting order films in an archive and the tinting notes are lost. Years ago, film historian and preservationist Kevin Brownlow found the original 1922 Sherlock Holmes with John Barrymore in tinting order, but with no notes. Like assembling a jigsaw puzzle, he slowly began to piece the film back together, and he said that the more effort he put in, the more he realized that it was a really lousy picture. These are the joys and sorrows that archivists go through every day. This scene was originally done in what was called the Handschlegel process that allowed coloring of specific portions of the frame. The way they did this is a separate print of the sequence was prepared with all but the area that you wanted colored blocked out. They would then develop that film, and the film would now take up a dye in the exposed area, and this could then be printed directly onto a black and white print using a dye transfer process. The original Handschlegel footage in this sequence no longer exists, but it has been recreated using hand painting on the 35mm print used for the sequence in this release. Chaney's performance is so terrific in this that it carries the film, but it also shows how relatively weak Philbin and Carey are in their roles. Despite their leading roles, they were really just minor supporting players providing a backdrop for Chaney. Somewhere about here in the film, or shortly after this sequence, there was originally an extended graveyard sequence with Lon Chaney playing the violin. If you've seen the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical, you'll remember this as the Wishing You Were Somehow Here Again sequence, which is one of the more powerful moments in the show. The sequence was shot for this film, and I have stills of Chaney playing the violin, but in early previews, many people felt the scene, with Christine mourning her dead father, was too grim, and the entire sequence was removed. The scene of the Phantom playing the violin, however, was used in many of the print ads. This must have been confusing to audiences who see him with a violin in the ads, but playing an organ in the movie. Studying Lon Chaney is really frustrating because so many of his films are lost. For those of us who enjoy silent films, lost films are a fact of life. Hardly any actor or director who worked prior to 1930 can claim that all of his or her work is extant, and in many cases, major portions of careers are lost. For example, Greta Garbo's admirers cry about the fact that only a fragment of her silent feature, The Divine Woman, survives, but all her other films are available. Likewise, Emil Janning's Oscar-winning performance in The Way of All Flesh, Ernst Lubitsch's The Patriot, F.W. Murnau's The Four Devils, and Joseph von Sternberg's The Case of Lena Smith are all missing, victims of either neglect, carelessness, or nitrate decomposition. Even a few of D.W. Griffith's 457 biograph shorts can't be found in any film archive, and Laurel and Hardy and Charlie Chaplin each have one lost short. But if you're a Lon Chaney fan, you're really disappointed. Chaney had 153 billed film appearances and at least 5 unbilled appearances that we know of. By my count, only 51 of these survive, so about 1/3, and several of these are fragments only. The survival rate of his later films is pretty good, and of the 41 films he appeared in from 1920 on, 29 survive in some form or another. But from his early Universal period, it's really pitiful. Of the 114 Universal films Chaney appeared in prior to 1920, only 15 survive, and several of these are incomplete. How does a film end up lost, anyway? Well, there's a number of reasons. Prior to about 1948, virtually all 35mm theatrical film were printed on nitrocellulose film stock. That's a close relative of the same material used to make explosives. If you've read news reports about bombs being made with nitrate fertilizers, you get the idea. Nitrate is a highly flammable film stock that once it starts burning is next to impossible to extinguish, and over time it decomposes and the rotting nitrate can become explosive. We saw examples of this prior to the Unmasking Scene, where I pointed out all of the modeling in the film. Many silent films have been lost to nitrate fires or decomposition. Here we are with Ledoux again. And again, in the 1925 version, this sequence was expanded a little more, where we learn more about how Ledoux has tracked Eric over the years, being played by Lon Chaney. Getting back to lost films, you've probably heard figures like 90% of all silent films are lost, but that's a slight exaggeration. Of the 10,868 American-produced silent feature films, some 2,769 exist in some form, and about 2,360 are more or less complete, for a survival average of about 22%, which is still pretty awful. Some studios like MGM made an effort to preserve their silent films, and MGM has a surprisingly good 70% survival rate on their silent features. But Fox and Paramount were pretty bad about saving films, and Universal was positively the worst. In 1948, facing rising costs associated with storage and insurance for their original nitrate prints, Universal had every silent film in their vaults melted down to extract the silver from the prints. The only titles saved were those that had a soundtrack. This would have resulted in almost complete elimination of the Universal silent output, if not for the show-at-home prints I mentioned earlier, and they released Hunchback and Phantom as show-at-homes, and that's why they survive. As I mentioned previously, this print of Phantom survives as the foreign release print of the 1929 sound reissue, which presumably was saved just because it was associated with a sound release. So many of Chaney's key performances are missing, especially those done in his early years at Universal, that it's nearly impossible to study the development of his screen persona. If I could locate some lost films from which to judge Chaney's career, I'm not sure quite what I'd pick, but I think it would be an odd list. Certainly his first makeup role, the sea urchin from 1913, or one of his early comedy roles like an elephant on his hands, also from 1913, would be fascinating. Chaney directed several films for Universal in 1915, including The Stool Pigeon, For Cash, and The Oyster Dredger, and I'd love to see any of those. Chaney directed a film called The Chimney Secret in 1915, where he both directed and played a double role. Many years ago, I acquired the remains of the estate of George Chaney, Lon's youngest brother. Lon would send home photos with notes scribbled on the back, and he would send him notes like, "Ooh, this is me, I played a Russian prince," or "I'm the one on the left." He sent George 3 different photos from The Chimney Secret, which leads me to believe that he was particularly proud of that film. There are many other Chaney films that are lost that are quite key films in his career. Father and the Boys from 1915 and Hell Morgan's Girl from 1917 were pivotal roles in his career. It would also be fun to see The Kaiser the Beast of Berlin from 1918, not just for Chaney, but for Rupert Julian's performance. The Kaiser is in fact listed on the American Film Institute's 10 Most Wanted list of lost films. Of the films Chaney made after he left Universal, the survival rate is much better, but there are still several major films that are unavailable, including Treasure Island from 1920, which may be of greater interest for the stylish direction of Maurice Tourneur than for Chaney's appearance as a pirate. I'd also love to see The Next Corner, a 1924 Paramount release. It'd be a real curiosity with Chaney very much out of character playing a fiery Latin seducer. One of the most important lost films from Chaney's career is his star-making role in The Miracle Man from 1919. A 2-minute clip does exist as part of a movie milestone series that Paramount issued in the 1930s, and that's just enough to whet your appetite and make you want to see the whole thing. A Blind Bargain from 1922, where Chaney plays both a mad scientist and an ape man, is at the top of my want-to-find list. For many horror buffs, London After Midnight, which Chaney made under director Todd Browning in 1927, is the holy grail of all lost silence, but it isn't on my list. Film historians and collectors William K. Everson and David Bradley both saw London After Midnight in the early 1960s before it was destroyed in the MGM vault fire, and both described it as simply awful. Bill Everson said it was a few minutes of cool vampire footage and a long stretch of Polly Moran comic relief. So that isn't my first choice of a lost Chaney to turn up. Simon Bouquet is played here by Gibson Gowland. He has a small part in this film, but the previous year he starred in Erich von Stroheim's Greed, an epic drama based on the novel McTeague. The film was originally shot at a length of 40 reels, but only the 10-reel cut-down survives today. And those missing 30 reels, since we're talking about lost films, are about as close to the holy grail that film buffs get. For a while in the 1970s and 80s, there were Chaney films popping up in a variety of strange places. The 1922 Oliver Twist was found in Yugoslavia around 1973. The 1920 version of Todd Browning's Outside the Law was found in a barn under a pile of chicken feathers in Minnesota in the mid-70s. The Oubliette from 1914 turned up under a porch in Georgia in 1983. And it just keeps getting weirder. In 1978, in the Canadian Yukon, when an excavation for a new recreation center was begun in Dawson City, a bulldozer came up with a shovel full of reels of nitrate film. Dawson City used to be the end of the distribution line for many films, and the titles were stored at the local library until 1929, when the flammable nitrate was used as landfill in a condemned swimming pool. Stored for 50 years under the permafrost of the Yukon, the films turned out to be extremely well preserved, and 2 of Chaney's 3 films made for Universal's Red Feather Productions in 1916 turned up. Here now is Christine singing Faust. I should say a word about the score. Phantom has been shown with many different scores over the years. The original San Francisco premiere in September 1925 was shown with an orchestral score by Joseph Carl Breil, who's best known as the composer of the score for The Birth of a Nation. But the East Coast premiere later that month at the Astor Theater in New York City was first announced as being by Professor Gustav Hindricks, but what actually opened was accompanied by a score by Eugene Conti. Then, to confuse the issue, Universal issued an official score published by Bellwin Music that was the Hendrix score, but credited as compiled by Mo Winkler. But all these scores had in common, of course, was use of the Gounod opera music from Faust, such as the famous spinning song we're using here. There are many more musical scores among the countless video, TV, and DVD versions. A number of prominent theater organists have recorded scores for this, and British composer Carl Davis did a new orchestral score for Kevin Brownlow's photoplay release of the 1929 version. And to show how low some distributors will stoop, Milestone Films even asked me to score the original 1925 version for their DVD release. Universal issued different versions of cue sheets for the 1925 and 29 versions, and Mo Winkler is credited as being the compiler of the cue sheets. A cue sheet is basically a 2 to 3 page list of all the scenes with musical recommendations for each scene. I don't care much for using cue sheets because they tend to rely on common popular music that an accompanist can easily find. The resulting score sounds more like Muzak than an original score carefully matched to the film. But I did use the cue sheet when matching up some of the Faust music for the score. Here's Arthur Edmund Carew again as Ledoux. As I mentioned, in the 1925 version, there's several sequences with Ledoux that are expanded, and we learn more about him. But they've cut out much of that explanation in this release, which is okay because it just leaves him as kind of a mysterious figure that's never explained. The original 1925 version of Phantom was a tremendous popular success when it was released. The film cost $632,357 by the time the final print was previewed, including about $50,000 that was due to all the retakes and the new scenes being shot. But the expense was worth it, as Phantom would go on to earn $2,014,091 in revenues, which is one of the largest grosses for any film of the silent era. The film earned Universal a profit of $539,682, and that was before the sound reissue. Phantom was generally well received when it was released, but the praise wasn't unanimous. The New York Times wrote, "The Phantom of the Opera is an ultra-fantastic melodrama, an ambitious production in which there is much to marvel at in the scenic effects. Lon Chaney impersonates the Phantom. It is a role suited to his liking and one which he handles with a certain skill, a little exaggerated at times, but none the less compelling. The most dramatic touch is where Christine in the cellar abode is listening to the masked Phantom as he plays the organ. Then he steals up behind him and suddenly snatches the mask from the Phantom's face. In the theater last night, a woman behind us stifled a scream when this happened." Moving Picture World is a trade publication, and they said, "The story has been produced on a stupendous scale. Among the sets are those representing the interior of the famed opera house, and they are said to be authentic in every detail. This effect has also been enhanced by presenting many of the scenes in natural color. Obviously, the title role was one for Lon Chaney, and he gives a superb performance. Here was another chance to distinguish himself as an unrivaled artist in character makeup, and he has done just that." And while the film was very popular with the public, some critics really hated it. Variety hated the picture, and they said this about it: "Universal has turned out another horror. This newest of U's specials is probably the greatest inducement to nightmare that has yet been screened. Lon Chaney is again the goat in the matter, no matter if it is another tribute to his character acting. His makeup as the hunchback within the Notre Dame Cathedral was morbid enough, but this is infinitely worse, as in this instance his body is normal with a horrible face solely relied upon for the effect. It's impossible to believe there are a majority of picturegoers who prefer this revolting sort of a tale on the screen." Phantom was certainly a profoundly influential film. It has inspired at least 5 film remakes in 1943, 62, 83, 89, and 90, numerous rip-offs, and the blockbuster Andrew Lloyd Webber musical. A personal favorite knockoff of mine, albeit a strange film, is Brian De Palma's The Phantom of the Paradise from 1974, which is a rock music version with Paul Williams both writing the score and appearing as the Phantom. It's really strange. Check it out. If you compare the 1925 version of Phantom with the musical, you'll be struck by how similar they are, and Andrew Lloyd Webber has acknowledged in interviews how much the Chaney version influenced him. The Chaney version of Phantom is listed by most historians as one of the 10 greatest films of all time and shows up on virtually every list of both great silent films and great horror films. In addition to enjoying his movies, I've always been interested in Chaney's life. And researching Chaney's life is difficult, and not just because he died in 1930, which then eliminates the possibility of sitting down with a ghostwriter and knocking out a good autobiography, as so many other stars and directors have done. Chaney, the actor, was somewhat of a recluse. He led a quiet, modest life, which is not the material that makes for shocking exposé biographies. I've interviewed a number of actors and technical staff who work with Chaney, and when asked what he was like in private life, with few exceptions, the answer was always the same. Priscilla Bonner, who worked with Chaney in Shadows, put it best when she told me, "He was a nice man, but I didn't know him very well." Chaney himself admitted to preferring an anonymous lifestyle. In an interview with Gladys Hall in the July 1930 issue of Motion Picture, he said, "I am not a recluse, nor am I reticent among my own friends or with my family. I am not, I suppose, the modern school of actor. I am not, I discover, an actor at all. I never make personal appearances. I am never more uncomfortable than on the rare occasions when I am in public and someone pokes someone else and says audibly, 'There goes Lon Chaney.' It is not policy, but my inclination is to shout back, 'Yes, and none of your damn business.' I care nothing whatever about fame. The less I have of it, the better for me personally. I work for money, and I work because I am interested in the things I do. If I were not, I wouldn't do them." Researching Chaney's career and life is made even more difficult by the incredible amount of myth and fabrication made up about him. Fan magazines and other contemporary publications are notorious for their misinformation. I guess if they couldn't get the truth, they would just make it up. As one example, in the Blue Book of the Screen, editor Ruth Wing wrote of him, "Chaney is fond of reading, his favorites being the works of Emerson and Dumas and Wells' Outline of History." But in a 1930 interview, Chaney told Gladys Hall, "I never read. For what I need, I go to life direct." Lon Chaney's story is now the stuff of legend. Lon's maternal grandmother, Emma Kennedy, had 2 daughters and a son, and all 3 were born deaf mutes. Kennedy turned the tragedy of her children into action, and she founded the Deaf and Blind Institute of Colorado. Her eldest daughter married Hugh Harbert, who edited the Colorado Deaf and Blind Index published by the Institute. Her younger daughter, Emma, married a deaf barber named Frank Chaney. Leonidas Chaney was born to Frank and Emma in Colorado Springs on April 1st, 1883. Always called Lon by his friends and family, he was the second of 4 children born to deaf-mute parents, but his older brother John, his younger sister Caroline, and his youngest brother George all had normal speech and hearing. Lon dropped out of school in 4th grade to take care of his mother, who was bedridden with rheumatism, so he had very little formal education, but he was clearly well educated from non-conventional sources, because later in life he wrote articulately on subjects as diverse as makeup and prison reform. Many credit Chaney's wonderful ability to do pantomime on the fact that he had to converse with his mother at a young age by acting out the events of the day for her. John Chaney had been working as house manager of a local theater and arranged for Lon to work as a prop boy at the Grand Opera House. Lon found the work amusing, but felt he needed a real job. He ran errands for a while in a mining exchange, and he also led tour groups up to the top of Pikes Peak. He worked in the window shade, drapery, and carpet laying business, and having learned the trade at a local store, accepted a position with Corditz and Feldhauser, the largest drapery house in Denver. He stuck with the job for 3 years, but when John wrote that he wanted Lon for a new production of Said Pasha, a comic opera their local company was producing, Lon said goodbye to the drapery business, and we can all be thankful of that. Lon was a natural dancer and a born comic, if you can believe that about the man known for his horrific roles. He developed a variety of fast and furious comic dances that could bring the house down at every performance. If Said Pasha had flopped, the way so many amateur productions do, Lon might have returned to the interior decorating business, but miraculously it was a hit. With money in their pockets and a cocky air of success, the boys produced Gilbert and Sullivan's Mikado and hired professional actors for the key parts, and again they had a hit on their hands. So in 1901, the Chaney brothers took their newfound company on the road with a production of Fra Diavolo, a musical, an operetta that was later done by Laurel and Hardy in the 30s. The boys dragged the show from town to town in Colorado, but the job of ticket-taking, bill posting, building sets, managing, and acting was just too much for them. The tenor of the show, Charles Holmes, offered to buy the show and keep them on as actors, so they sold out. Holmes took them throughout the West at a time when large areas of the country were still referred to as Indian Territory. He led them through Oklahoma, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Arkansas, and Texas. Many of the cow towns they played were starved for entertainment, and the troupe was always enthusiastically received. The theaters were usually stores, halls, schoolrooms, and tents. In an interview with Ruth Waterbury, Lon recalled a performance of Said Pasha where coal oil lamps were used for the footlights. When the scene called for a light change, one of the performers would wander to the front of the stage, still delivering lines, and turn the lamps up or down to suit the mood. During the tour, Lon and Cleva Creighton, a lovely young 16-year-old singer who had joined the troupe in Oklahoma, were married. They were married in May of 1905. The company was performing The Beggar Prince in Columbus, South Carolina, when funds ran out and the group was stranded. William Cranston, a Canadian theater manager, heard of the company's predicament and wired them funds to reach Halifax, Nova Scotia. Cranston sent them west to Vancouver, performing at the mining camps, dance halls, and backwoods schools along the way. In addition to The Beggar Prince, the company had added The Royal Chef and A Night for a Day to their repertoire. After struggling through the Canadian towns, the troupe stranded again and somehow managed to find their way back to Chicago. By the time they reached Chicago, Cleva was pregnant. Creighton told Chaney was born on February 10, 1906, the only child Lon would ever have. The boy was given his mother's maiden name, and Tull was in honor of the owner of a furniture store who had given Lon a job. And of course, Creighton is known today as Lon Chaney Jr., star of The Wolfman, of Mice and Men, and many other films, but he wasn't named Jr. until after Lon Chaney, sometimes called Lon Chaney Sr., had died. Life in Chicago was terrible. Out of work, Lon begged for food and found odd jobs wherever he could. Little is known about Lon's life from 1906 to 1910, as he never spoke about this period of his life in interviews. He worked odd jobs both in and out of theaters. Around 1910, he was given the job of stage manager for The Girl in the Kimono, and the entire family went on the road with the new show. Lon tried out for one of the comedian roles in the show, but lost it to a young comic named Lee Moran. Moran went on to greater glory, working with Eddie Lyons as part of the comedy team of Lyons and Moran. If life in Chicago had been unpleasant, life on the road was even worse. The show limped from burg to burg, with the entire company not knowing where the next meal would come from. John Chaney had moved to Southern California and was working as a theater manager, so when the show finally folded, Lon took his paltry savings and moved his family to Los Angeles. Lon found it relatively easy to find work in L.A. He spent 6 months at the Olympic Theater with a musical comedy stock company and made $35 a week, which was a princely sum in those days. He then moved across the street to the Grand Opera House, where Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, Robert Z. Leonard, and Francis White were the stars. Years later, Robert Leonard would direct Chaney in the film Danger Goes Slow. Working in L.A. In early 1912, Lon signed with the Fisher's Follies. This series of comedies was produced by a man called Pop Fisher, and they were extremely popular and received prominent coverage by the press. Lon appeared in many of the Fisher's Follies productions throughout 1912, including The Never Homes, The Songbirds, Tilly's Nightmare, When Johnny Comes Marching Home, The Man Who Owns Broadway, The Chaperones, The Yankee Prince, An American Idea, I.O.U., The Kissing Bugs, and Little Johnny Jones, and that's the George M. Cohan musical that introduced the songs Yankee Doodle Dandy and Give My Regards to Broadway, which of course were featured in the movie Yankee Doodle Dandy, starring James Cagney, and James Cagney went on to play Lon Chaney in the Universal film The Man of a Thousand Faces. I want to digress from telling you about Chaney's life for a moment to point out this next sequence coming up. This was another example of the Handschlegel process with hand coloring. As with the rooftop sequence, the original Handschlegel is lost, and this is not original footage, but it's been recreated for this particular release. Here we have fire and flames, and the coloring is very effective here. When you don't have color film, you try to do what you can with tinting and hand coloring. No one really knows exactly how Lon Chaney first entered films, but we know that he appeared as early as November 1912 in a Universal production called The Honor of the Family. He was still working in the theater in 1912-1913, and he must have been walking across town from the theater to Universal production companies to try and pick up quick work to add a little income for his family. Relations with his wife began deteriorating during this period, possibly because his popularity was growing and hers was fading. If you've seen A Star is Born, you know where this is heading. On April 29, 1913, Cleva attempted suicide by drinking bichloride of mercury. She survived, but her singing voice was ruined. Lon went on to file for divorce. He got custody of Creighton, and he never spoke of Cleva again. In 1915, he remarried to Hazel Hastings, a chorus dancer who had appeared in some shows with Lon, and they remained married until Lon's death. Lon would often even tell people that Hazel was Creighton's mother. By August 1913, Lon had his first billed appearance in a comedy called Poor Jake's Demise, and amazingly, this early film has recently been uncovered by film archivist and historian Serge Bromberg, and it's a delight to see what Chaney could do with a comedy. Also in 1913, Chaney had his first makeup role, appearing as a hunchback in The Sea Urchin. By 1915, Lon was being paid the princely sum of $45 a week, but during his years at Universal, he never signed a contract with them. There was really no breakaway success for Lon in his years at Universal. There was no one film that suddenly propelled him into the spotlight. He just kept getting better parts and giving better performances, and each film was another step up the ladder. As I mentioned earlier, he directed 6 films for Universal in 1915, but he must have lost his taste for directing because after this half dozen, he never returned to directing again, with the exception of some scenes he might have directed in Phantom, which is hearsay we can't confirm today, and no one knows what scenes those might be. Universal Studios at the time consisted of a lot of small production companies who specialized in particular types of films. For example, Imp made comedies, Nestor made westerns, and so on. Lon would move around between these companies as work was available. Lon moved over to Universal's Red Feather Photoplays in 1916 to make The Mark of Cain, where he played a man serving a prison term for a crime his father commits. Lon received top billing for the first time in his career for this film. Another important film in his career was Hal Morgan's Girl, released in 1917. During production of the film, Lon had to make a backflip from a roof. He slipped and landed on the back of his head, and in a 1929 interview, he joked, "I ain't been right since." By 1918, Lon was becoming dissatisfied with his treatment at Universal. Although he was working steadily, his films were low-budget potboilers that received only minor attention from the critics and the public. Universal specialized in this small-budget, quickly produced programmer type of film. All the films from this period were very modest productions, costing between $5,000 and $10,000. The films consistently earned about $20,000 for Universal, which was enough to pay back the production and advertising costs and provide a small profit. This was the type of fare that Carl Laemmle could sell as filler to the many film exchanges in the backwater towns hungry for anything with sprocket holes. Lon considered leaving Universal, but continued to turn out films at an average of about one a month. His first release of 1918 was The Grand Passion, and he only received 4th billing behind Dorothy Phillips, William Stoll, and Jack Mulhall. This must have been disappointing for him. By 1918, Lon was making $100 a week. Lon asked for a raise to $125 a week and was turned down, and that was the last straw, and he walked out. He was out of work for months, but eventually Western star William S. Hart hired him to appear as the villain in Riddle Gone for $125 a week. Hart was a major star. He and Tom Mix were the 2 major silent Western stars at the time, and he put a lot of money into his productions with very good directors. The film was a big success, propelled Lon forward again, and Lon went back to Universal and asked for and got his higher salary. Lon spent much of the next 7 years freelancing with many studios. He worked on and off at Universal, making a couple memorable films with director Todd Browning, The Wicked Darling in 1919 and Outside the Law in 1920. He made several pictures for Samuel Goldwyn, including The Penalty, The Ace of Hearts, and A Blind Bargain, and 3 for Paramount, Victory, The False Faces, and Treasure Island. The Miracle Man, made for an independent producer but released by Paramount, was a huge success. He played a contortionist who helped put over a con game with a fake faith healer, and the film was a mega hit and really cemented Chaney's star status. By 1922, he got the top billing in almost every film he appeared in after that point. Again, I love Chaney's look, I love the makeup, I love the lighting in this scene. With Hunchback of Notre Dame in 1923, he acquired superstar status and soon began to work for the newly formed Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Company and starred in their very first release, He Who Gets Slapped from 1924. He appeared in an independent Roland West production, The Monster, after that, and an MGM film, The Unholy Three, both in 1925, before accepting the role in Phantom. After completing Phantom of the Opera, Chaney signed a contract with MGM and finished out his career with the studio. While making Thunder in 1929, he began to be ill. There have been many wild theories about how Lon died. One story has artificial snow from thunder lodging in his throat. Another said that all his disguises and paraphernalia he wore, such as the penalty, caused such pain and body injury that he died from that. But the truth is quite simple. Lon was a very heavy smoker, and he died of cancer of the lungs and esophagus on August 26th of 1930. Before his death, Lon made one sound film, a talkie remake of his 1925 hit, The Unholy Three. He was able to do multiple voices in the film, and some in the press joked about him now being the man of 1,000 voices. A number of sound projects were slated for Chaney when he died. A number of those roles ended up going to Wallace Beery, but another interesting Gaston Leroux story, The Phantom of Paris, went to John Gilbert and was released in 1931. It's quite a good film if you ever get to check it out. Lon Chaney is certainly known as a master of makeup. In addition to his hideous portrayal in this film, he was a Chinaman in Mr. Wu, Shadows and Outside the Law, a vampire in London After Midnight, Cripples in The Shock, Flesh and Blood, The Blackbird and West of Zanzibar, a contortionist in The Miracle Man, clowns in He Who Gets Slapped and Laugh Clown Laugh, an ape man in A Blind Bargain, a hunchback in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, The Sea Urchin and Alas and Alack, old men in If My Country Should Call, The Chimney Secret, Oliver Twist and Thunder, and a pirate in Treasure Island. He was armless in The Unknown, legless in The Penalty, missing an eye in The Road to Mandalay, and disfigured in Where East is East. The late film collector Herb Graff once said to me, "I just can't take these Lon Chaney films. He keeps losing his body parts." But for those who think of Chaney only as a master of makeup, you need to check out his straight roles. He works largely without makeup in Nomads of the North, The Light in the Dark, The Unholy Three, Tell It to the Marines, and While the City Sleeps. I think Tell It to the Marines is one of his best films, where he plays a tough drill sergeant trying to make a Marine out of wimpy William Haynes. The original ending had the Phantom found by the mob lying dead at the keyboard of his organ. And there are scenes of that, still scenes of that shot. But this was considered too much of an anticlimax by Carl Laemmle. And Eddie Sedgwick, as I mentioned earlier, was assigned to direct this new climax we're seeing, in which the Phantom escapes the mob by first commandeering a carriage with a subsequent chase on foot through the Paris streets to the bank of the Seine. This certainly adds an exciting climax to the film, and the lighting here is particularly effective, I think. As we close, I feel obligated to acknowledge a number of people who contributed directly and indirectly to this commentary track, and to point you to some other recommended reading and films. I highly recommend the excellent two-part article by Scott McQueen in the September-October 1989 issues of American Cinematographer, and I've gotten quite a bit of material for this commentary track from that article. And for the definitive biography of Lon Chaney, I recommend Lon Chaney, The Man Behind the Thousand Faces by Michael F. Blake. Michael is a successful Hollywood makeup man, and his detailed descriptions of the makeups Chaney created are alone worth the purchase price. David Pierce and David Shepard, the producer of this DVD, also provided useful information to me while I was preparing this commentary track. And finally, I'll make a shameless plug for my website, lonchaney.org, where I have information on all of Chaney's films. If you enjoyed The Phantom of the Opera, I recommend some of Chaney's other great films, including Victory, The Penalty, The False Faces, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, The Unholy Three, Tell It to the Marines, The Unknown, Laugh Clown Laugh, and West of Zanzibar. Even some of the really weak films like The Trap, Flesh and Blood, The Road to Mandalay, and Mockery are worth seeing, if only for Chaney's performance. If you look quickly right here, you'll see the Notre Dame Cathedral set, still standing from The Hunchback of Notre Dame. It's still up there, was a very authentic replica of Notre Dame. And since they're in Paris for Phantom of the Opera, use the set if they've got it. And in this final scene, we see the utterly mad Eric, totally crazed now, first holding off the crowd, and then giving up. Here now is the final scene, shot by Eddie Sedgwick, where, totally crazed, the mom attacks him and literally tears him to pieces. And with this appropriately horrific ending, we will close. This is Jon Mirsalis, and I've been your host for this look at the wonderful work of Lon Chaney in The Phantom of the Opera. I hope you enjoyed this, and thanks for listening.